Good afternoon. And on behalf of the Smithsonian Center for Education and Museum Studies, I'd like to welcome all of you to this, a very special session, something that we've been excited about for so long. I'd like to welcome our special guest, Paul Peck. Thanks to you, your encouragement, we are here today. And also thanks to Judy Gaines, the newly appointed director of the Paul Peck Humanities Institute at Rockwell College, now Montgomery College. And it is under that partnership with Smithsonian that we have been doing these seminars for the last 6 years. There's a special, very related seminar theme this year, which is the politics of civil rights, inclusion and exclusion in the arts and humanities. A timely topic. This is election year. We're all surrounded by debates, radio, television, in the metro, offices, wherever. It's about civil rights, it's about liberty, it's about the meaning of freedom, citizenship, and all of that will be discussed today and for the sessions to come. This is our opening session, and in the seminars to come that will follow until the 6th of May, we will be looking at Brown versus Board of Education at the National Museum of American History. We will look at the politics of visual arts at the National Museum of African Art. We will hear from the director of the Center for Latino Initiatives, the politics of civil rights through the lens of Latino initiatives and issues. We will also hear from the director of the Asian Pacific American Program about the politics of race and how it affects Asian Americans, and in a more general way, while we look at a more perfect union exhibition at National Museum of American History. Finally, maybe most of you haven't been there, we will be going to the George Gustav Heiss Center in New York and see some of their new exhibitions. So it's a very rich, very full program, and I'm sure we're all going to have lots of fun. For today, it is my distinct honor to present Dr. Richard Kurin, one of the most sought-after intellects at the Smithsonian. Richard is the director of the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, and thanks to him, we have the very popular Folklife Festival at the National Mall every year. He's also in charge of Folkways recordings, the Ralph Rinsler Folklife Archives, several educational and cultural programs that have won Academy, Emmy, and Grammy Awards. Richard joined the Smithsonian in 1985 to produce the Festival of India, and that was my entry into the Smithsonian, and I've been a great fan of Richard's ever since. He has produced major events at the Smithsonian, including the America's Millennium on the Mall, Smithsonian's 150th birthday celebration on the Mall. People around the world are still talking about the Silk Road, the project that Richard and his office produced 2 years ago, and we have some of our Montgomery College fellows bring their students and do projects, and that's exactly what this seminar, this partnership is all about. Currently, Richard is working on the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C., and a festival to mark the opening of the National Museum of the American Indian, which will open in September, right on the Mall. And those are going to be very exciting opening events. A Fulbright scholar, a PhD in cultural anthropology from Chicago University, several publications, teaching assignments, we could go on and on. He's also doing research on the Hope Diamond, sits on the board of UNESCO. Richard's book, Reflections from a Cultural Broker, was assigned for all of you, so I'm sure you'll have questions to follow. An anthropologist fully equipped to discuss the topic, Anthropologies of Inclusion, Recognizing a Common Humanity. And now, it's over to Dr. Richard Kurin.
Thank you, Angela. I don't know how equipped I am to do this. I said to the group earlier before we started that I'm starting to work on a book, and the book I'm starting to work on, tentative title is Are Humans One? Is Mankind One? Is Humankind One? It seems a kind of simple question to ask, and yet in a very divided world these days, it may be even a more crucial one to answer. As I think about the politics of civil rights, issues of inclusion and exclusion, and to me civil rights are, I use the terminology, maybe a more international terminology of human rights, and there is a historical connection that I'll talk about later. But, you know, to me, the issue is, do we understand from an anthropological perspective, in any case, the perceived understandings of the status of human beings in different places around the world, and then the rights, privileges, and obligations according to those people in society? That is, how do different people in the universe divide up humanity within their own society and with others? And then how do they accord those different categories, if they do make different categories, and from all evidence is people do have different categories of dividing up human beings, how do they understand the differential status, legal obligations, and rights that accord to those people? Because you can obviously have a situation where you say, hey, yes, you know, there are different categories of human beings and all of them have the same rights. Or you can have a situation where you say, hey, wait, we have 82 different varieties of human beings and there are 82 different varieties of rights, just like ketchup. So as I start to look at that question and the issue of equity, the issues of equality, of who's included as human and not, it strikes me that the word itself, human, is a kind of funny word, at least in English, because it's used in both marked and marked senses. So on one point we can talk about human rights, and then when we talk about human rights we also are quite aware of the fact that through history, across geography, some people have been defined as less than human. There have been arguments in the Vatican. There have been arguments in different governments. There have been arguments in the seats of empires. Are these people that we're dealing with human or not? And we've seen through developments in the United States, we've seen developments in other countries where there is a dehumanization of certain populations. Nazi Germany, concentration camps, gulags in the Soviet Union. Now, the source of those dehumanizations can be varied. But what do I recall? I recall when I was a boy in 15, 13, 15, 16. I mean, you know, the Spanish and the Portuguese, when they were dividing up the New World, you know, with Brazil and what was going to be Brazil, what was going to be Spain. I mean, it was a papal bull. They had to figure out, are Indians, are these indigenous native peoples that we've discovered human beings or not? It really brings into that focus. So there's this initial assumption of human beingness. Now, we're not talking about objective scientific fact. Of course, people are human beings. But the question is, in the conceptual schema that allocates status and rights to certain people, are people human beings or not? There's also, in that term human, there's a notion of man, which was an older form that was used. And man, you know, we know has been used generically, i.e. the family of man, i.e. as in mankind or humankind. Well, but there's also a marked sense of the term man, as we know, man versus woman. And there, too, is that issue of gender in defining basic characteristics of humanity. Are male humans different than female humans? And that's a question of not only in terms of how society conceptualizes that difference, but then the status, the obligations, the rights that are accorded that difference. A difference may not make a legal difference, or it may. Similarly, the term man, we sometimes distinguish man from boy, i.e. I'm a man and I can do this. You're a boy, you're not old enough, so you can't drive. Okay, so implicit in that whole notion of man in that sense is the sense of age differentiation, and then what goes along with it. What are the rights, obligations, and privileges which might go to someone being older than someone being younger. Of course, then we have manly versus unmanly. And sometimes a code word, at least when I grew up in Queens, New York, playing football, you know, that was kind of code of whether you were, you know, full-blooded male or whether maybe you were a strange to the football team, and maybe you didn't share the same sexual orientation. So we get marked notions of manliness. Then, of course, in some societies, you have notions of big man. And anthropologists know this well. In societies, you have the big man, and then you have, but other people are men too. Yes, they're men, but that's the big man. And in that sense, the marking of man means wealth or a political status or stature. Then there's a man's man versus just a man. Physical prowess, physical stature. Of course, we have the thinking man versus the man. The thinking man has, discriminated upon intellectual grounds. And, do societies then give different rights? If they recognize that some people are more thinking and other people are less thinking, do we accord more privileges, more rights to people who are more thinking? Question. And then there's the issue of man, i.e. as in a man, i.e. a person, as in an individual, that we cognize the idea of individuals, versus man as in a collective sense, as in men, or a group of people, or mankind. That is, does that term, if we differentiate between individuals and we differentiate between groups, do we then differentiate the kind of rights, obligations, responsibilities, and duties that should pertain to individuals as opposed to those groups? Fast thinking on that, if you think about U.S. law, corporations are people, right? They're a legal person. So we make things that aren't physical men and women into them. So those are just some of the distinctions, just looking at that kind of term, man or human. Now, note what I'm going to do is review how various societies, including our own through history, have kind of thought about the distinctions in different statuses of being human, and then try to look at what that's meant in terms of notions of the rights accorded to those people, their human rights, because it's hard to have rights that apply to humans if you have a question of what the human is that you're applying it to. Now, note in my talk here that I'm not referring to, that I am looking at this in terms of a cultural, conceptual framework and not a physical framework. That is, this is a talk about how we think about and conceptualize human beings culturally. The scientific facts are different, and the scientific facts in some cases may be seen by some as saying, well, that's science, science is only a category of cultural thinking. I mean, science does not get thunk outside of any cultural system. But if we just maybe stipulate that what we're talking about here is that all human beings, no matter how differentiated in terms of being humanized or dehumanized, occupying in what category, that all human beings actually share about, 95% of their genetic makeup with chimps. And indeed, when you think about some of the French writers in the late 19th century, there was an issue of whether to include like chimps and humans in the same category, the same species. But we genetically, in terms of if you look at DNA, we share about 95% of our genes with chimps, and human beings share about 99% of their genes with each other. So there is no human being that physically is more than 1% different from any other human being in terms of the genes they possess. So the question is, we have small differences, how much do we make of them? And how much have people made of them? There's no question in the scientific literature among physical anthropologists, and maybe, Jeannie, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea is that there is one human species living on the planet. People may debate about how that species took over the world, exactly when. I always thought it was about 40,000 years ago that Neanderthalensis stopped being Neanderthalensis and was Homo sapiens sapien, but I don't know, is that about 200,000? Okay, so that's a long time that people have been one species, and there are no lurking Neanderthals among us, despite what my daughters say about me. In terms of gender, yes, I think we're kind of predisposed to say that that has a scientific reality, a physical reality. Age, I think we're pretty much predisposed to say that there's only chronology, although again, looking at this group of hardworking faculty, some of us probably age a little faster and a little more than others. When it comes to other things like ethnicity, ethnicity is kind of hard to find physically. Race is a very interesting and problematic category that I think will come up over and over again through the course of the seminar. I think most anthropologists believe that race is a kind of invented social concept that takes into consideration various physical characteristics, but indeed is a culturally construed concept. However that is defined, we know that all human beings can indeed, if the lighting is low and the music is right and they have a desire, they can mate. And we do know that all human beings can, if they are in the circumstances, learn anybody else's culture. That is, you can take a baby from one born in Brooklyn or born in the South Bronx like I was. You can put that baby in Rajasthan, and that kid will grow up learning Rajasthani, assuming that the people around speak Rajasthani. And us, being our age, we kind of can also learn other people's cultures, albeit sometimes slowly, imperfectly, and maybe not with the same kind of natural facility, but nevertheless can indeed learn other people's culture. So the argument isn't so much what, in an objective sense, may be true, because I think in terms of anthropological knowledge, there is no final authoritative word on what kind of categories of human beings should be made up. There's no scientific finding that. You can't say, well, we know everybody's one species, therefore everybody should have the same rights. I mean, that's a question for different societies, different historical circumstances to play out, adjudicate, to argue, to negotiate, and to work out. Now, my kind of position as an anthropologist has been not so much to look at particular theories or theorists of anthropologists who professionally make up anthropologies about the rest of the world, although I've done that. I often taught a history of anthropology course, but what I've been more interested in is almost the kind of folk theories of anthropology, or the different societal notions of anthropologies. That is, how do you have in different societies people thinking about the nature of human beings? And that may not be taught in an anthropology 101 class in 800 BC in ancient in Greek, but people in ancient Greece were thinking about the nature of human beings and how human beings were similar and different, and what they did, and what kind of rights they should have, what kind of standing they should have. So I often look at how stuff is embedded in social action, embedded in religion, embedded in the social thought of various societies, in their action and schema, and then try to coax out what are the anthropological understandings within those. Now, what I'd like to do is kind of go through some particular cases around the world and through history to look at that. But let me start with something that we kind of think we all know, or we know pretty good, and we probably do know, as a basis for thinking anthropologically about fundamental nature of being human and the issue of rights. Our U.S. Constitution, Declaration of Independence. Core, central, key historical documents, certainly in the history of the development of human and civil rights. And I would argue that there's an anthropology surely assumed in them. Think about the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. All men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. From an anthropological perspective, this would sound like a very interesting and exceptional group of people. Maybe not even believable, given the ethnographic and ethnological literature. That is, what did these Americans at the late 18th century believe in? Well, they believed in these things that look like persons, all men, and men, I question we'll get to in a second, but the idea that there were somehow individuals who existed, they were created by some force, that their rights were birthrights. Rights were natural state of affairs to which they were born into. That there were fundamental pursuits of individuals, and that people actually formed the governments. Now, if you're a guy in the army in Genghis Khan's army thinking about this would seem very unlikely. I mean, just the idea of it. If you were a member of a Melanesian group on an island in the Pacific, this would be incomprehensible to think about this. Of course, in terms of our own system, we know that when the Declaration of Independence said all men, it didn't quite mean all men, it was qualified. And that was a qualified meaning that comes through in the Constitution, so that there were differentiations certainly between men and women. There were differentiations between free men, free persons and non-free persons, differentiation between Indians and non-Indians, and certainly in the Constitution between age groups, because you have to be a certain age of man to have the right to be a senator or representative or president and so on. And indeed, one can look at at the Bill of Rights coming out of the Constitution as really the notion of what rights meant at that point in American society. And the reason I'm doing this is not to give you a civics lesson, because you know this, and we all did this in 11th grade, and I'm sure people watching hopefully did it in 11th grade, and 9th grade, and 7th grade, and so on. But it's just to put out there so that when we start looking at other cases, it becomes very apparent about how strange this is. But when you look at the Bill of Rights, it becomes very clear that rights in individuals are really rights against the government. Those rights are to protect American citizens against government intrusion in their life. It's to say I can speak freely, I can assemble, and the government can't tell me what to do. Very, very interesting way of looking at things. And then as we look at, and as you'll look at through this year with the seminar, looking at the amendments and the various movements in terms of the 19th century, the Civil War, the amendments that grow up coming out of the Civil War in terms of the 14th Amendment, which is really, I think, key in terms of the contemporary civil rights movement. It kind of gives us our sense of where things are, because that was the Equal Protection of the Law Amendment, which basically said you have these civil rights and they extend to all citizens. Well, at that time, not quite all citizens, but almost all citizens. And that's been the basis after that. That was basically, that was used first and then led to, was a justification in terms of women's suffrage movement and continuing movements was, the idea that all citizens shared in these rights were enforceable and everybody should have access to them. And that's a very interesting proposition. That is that our citizenship is undifferentiated. It belongs to everybody. You can, and you do have around the world and through history, systems of citizenship that are much more differentiated. Different classes of citizens based on their supposed status of humanity. Okay. I think our assumptions that are embodied in something like the Declaration of Independence and constitutions are often challenged, and not so much they're stretched. We see them challenged in our own society, as we'll get to in some of our debates, but they also become very, very apparent when we start dealing with the exportation or the application of American assumptions about personhood, rights, categories of humans to other societies. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, it was very instructive when you saw another nation with a very different culture, a very different history, and then you want to apply certain notions to that society. These days, we're seeing it in Iraq, where fundamental categories of the person have to be addressed. Remember, in the Constitution, it's people who have rights against the government. It's not like we carved out different groups for different ethnic or religious groups or anything like that. It's not that certain things were reserved for one gender as opposed to another. So it becomes different. It also becomes different when you deal with a country like Afghanistan that, again, has a very different history and culture than the United States. And you say, okay, can I apply these things? Well, maybe, but who's the creator in all of this? Is the creator of men in the Declaration of Independence the same creator of people in Afghanistan? And very serious debates. So I think some of the drama of how this is so different comes out when we look at other cases. Most of my work as an anthropologist has been in India and Pakistan. Let me talk a bit about a comparative case, Laws of Manu. Very interesting ancient Indian text. Basically, in the Laws of Manu, let's read a passage, give you a flavor of this, okay? This is a passage concerning Purusha, the kind of code man. In order to protect this universe, he, the most resplendent one, assigned separate duties and occupations to those who sprang from his mouth, arms, thighs, and feet. Okay? Code man, different groups of human beings, varna, coming from different parts of that code man. Some people come from the mouth, some people come from the arms, some people from the thighs, some from the feet. To Brahmins, he assigned teaching and studying the Veda, sacrificing for their own benefit, and for others giving and accepting of alms. To the Kshatriya, next Varna, in the classic kind of four Varna system, to the Kshatriya he commanded to protect the people, warriors rather than priests. To bestow gifts, to offer sacrifice, to study the Veda and abstain from attaching himself to sensual pleasures. The Vaishya. These would be the people that come from the thighs. Kshatriyas are the arms, they're the warriors. Brahmins use words, and they come from the mouth. Vaishya, people who come from the thighs of the code man. To tend cattle, to bestow gifts. Everybody's giving gifts. Offer sacrifice, study the Veda, trade, lend money, cultivate land. Okay? Different occupational thing. One occupation only the Lord prescribed to the Shudra, to serve meekly, even these other three castes of Varna categories. Now, as the Brahman sprang from the mouth, he was the firstborn. And as he possesses the Veda, he is by right Lord of the whole creation. Now, here you have a theory, and you can look at this as, I think as a theory of how to explain social differences, how to explain differences among different people that you're confronting in your society. And in this one, it looks like different people are being defined in terms of almost different occupational roles, but it's not just occupational roles. Those occupational roles are subject of religious sanction. And people are not all the same. People are not, now let's go back to the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal and endowed by their Creator. This seems like a different kind of way of looking at things. So here you have a system where you can say, okay, people are created, and they're coming out of the same source. I mean, everybody's the same because they're coming out of the same code man, so to speak, but they're coming out of different parts. And the expectations about those people, because they have different kind of human natures, they have different roles in society and different codes of conduct. Now, I'd argue from Manu as well as others that the law is not so much bestowed by somebody. Somebody's not coming along and saying, okay, you folks are Brahmins, you folks are priests, you have these rules, you folks are Kshatriyas or warriors, you have these roles. But it's much more that this is people's rights are part of their natural constitution as human beings. Okay? So that people are not being assigned to these people, it's part of their very nature, their dharma, their dhatu dharma. This creates a very interesting situation because you now have a differentiation of different expectations, different norms, different privileges, and different laws based upon the notion of creation. Similarly, you have a notion of different age grades. So now we can say that, well, this is discrimination. This isn't fair. But this is a theory of society that ended up running a civilization for a whole long period of time. It's quite applicable. You have a system of age differentiation, the notion that a person growing up in the early stage should be a student. This is good. You all should like this because it gives us all jobs. So young people should be students. And then after you're a student, you should be part of a household and a householder. Then you should be a forest dweller. And then finally, you should be an ascetic and seek a religious attainment and liberation. So that is different duties, different laws, so to speak, different rights pertaining to your obligations by your very nature as a human being. Similarly, not so much, well, I think it actually maybe in Manu, certainly in other sources, in terms of gender, notions of what is the unit of the person? What is the social person? What is the legal person? Is it the individual, or is it a family unit, or is it a male-female dyad where people are half bodies of each other? That is, a male and a female married being regarded as a notion of a full person. If somebody isn't married, they're not quite a full person. They're incomplete. Well, if that's the case, then are you talking about not autonomous human beings and individuals surrounded by this body, but if the body is a complete body made full by a union of male and female, if that's the body, then that's the person. And if that has legal recognition, then that's the unit that has rights. This is not each individual having a set of rights, just like every other individual. Now, you find some similar notions in different degrees of elaboration. I'd probably say no one has elaborated it to the degree that it's been elaborated in Indian society over the course of 3,000 years in terms of social thought. But you do find similar thoughts among various East African societies in terms of the implicit notion that there are different categories of people, different varnas, different jatis, different almost a notion of almost like species in a way, that have coded conduct that have certain obligations and duties and rights in society. You find it sometimes in West Africa, particularly among I think the Malian kingdoms as well. You also find this notion of different people coming out of creation in different ways. So was it Julie? You do know African myths? Some Native American myths. Oh, Native American. Well, you know it quite well. I mean, you get those myths in the Southwest about people emerging out of the earth. They come in out of the earth. They come up from caves, and the first one comes up from caves, and they're not baked enough. And the second people up, and they're baked a little more. And the third group, it's like me making cookies. But that's the notion. And you can see where it came out of, an idea of, clay ovens and things like that. And, how do you explain different physical features? How do you explain different skin colors and all of that? And so you get this notion of that, everybody is from the earth, but they're differentiated from the earth. And that differentiation from the earth thus gives people different codes for what they're supposed to do in the world, a different charter, a different kind of humanity. Now, you get this in some Aboriginal societies in Australia, in the South Seas, but also through Native American and some African societies, and even in some of the Central Asian and shamanistic societies, notions of totemistic identification and ideas that people are associated with, that people are kind of one with their brethren, at least who live in that region, on that island, in that larger society. They may be fighting with each other, they may be celebrating with each other, but somehow they're in a relationship with these other people, and my totem is the bear, and your totem is the lion, and somebody else's totem is the raven. And those animals, to some degree, with the characteristics and myth told about them, exemplify the characteristics of those human beings. And so that those totemistic relationships, often tied through kinship and marriage and other forms of exchange, then predicate a whole series of social roles and responsibilities. Now, if I went to such a society and said, no, you're all endowed as individual human beings with your rights, what is that? What is that? The Greeks, of course, had their own ideas about this. Instead of baking in southwestern ovens, I think the Greeks smelted human beings. So they were the men of gold were the gods, or god. And then there were the men of silver. Then there was the men of silver. Then there was the men of bronze, and then the men of iron. And kind of a degenerating notion of the social order as different people got cooked and created. And actually, to me, it very much parallels the notion of yuga in India, where you have this notion of decreasing yuga. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we're in the Kali Yuga now. It's all going to hell in a handbasket. Can you say that on the web? But this notion of declining moral worth, that people are lesser human beings these days. We're not as good as we used to be, and my grandparents know that. But the Greeks thought that too, and so did the Indians. And but Greek society had a lot of different theories of. They had a lot of different kind of what I would call anthropology. So there was this, kind of degenerating nobility model. Hippocrates had his own model, the doctor guy. He was actually a wonderful anthropologist, and he was probably one of the first ones to really articulate a very strong notion of kind of environmental determinism in people. And so when he does his airs, waters, and places, he basically tries to explain cultural differences by arguing that, well, those people live up in the north and they live in the south, and they have they're colder people, they're hotter people, their blood is hot, we're cold. They have a lot of romance and sex. We think a lot. And basically started explaining a lot of people of the world in terms of, the air and the water of places. And we still have that. We have a refuge of that. Immanuel Kant actually picked that up from Hippocrates. Actually, Hippocrates gave that to Galen, picked it up. The Roman physician and philosopher picked that up. Then the Arabs took that. Ibn Sina took that, Avicenna, known in the West. He took that. As a kind of humoral medicine and systems of hot, cold, dry, wet. That really has spread a lot, certainly into not only across Asia, but into Latin America as well, with the Spanish. And, Kant, here's this highfalutin philosopher, right? Prolegomena to metaphysics and so on. And yet here's Kant talking about how Latins are hot and Germans are cold, and it's the same kind of way, but ideas of the construction of the person based on their environment and ways. And of course, you can't ask hot people to do cold things, because then you're going to get a lot of frustration and vice versa. A guy like Democritus, who talked about savagery and civilization, the mechanical sameness of simple societies, and the organic complementarity of more complex societies. Of course, he had in mind people that lived beyond the Greek city-states as the simple, mechanical, sane, more savage people, and people living in the cities as more organic, complementary groups of people. Plato, of course, was very strong on that notion of complementarity. So it didn't mean that everybody in society was equal by any means. Remember Plato? Like philosopher kings and slaves and all sorts of people. So differential rights. But the idea that somehow society was composed of a complementarity of people that had differential rights, differential status, differential standing, and yet somehow could be part of the same society. So, quite a different model than, I think, the kind of American one. And then there was Epicurus, my namesake, who probably actually devised an idea more on the basis of social contract, that basically people were, should pursue pleasures, and society was a compact of those individuals pursuing pleasures, that we meet again with the British utilitarians and John Locke and so on. One thinks of other ways, just very quickly, of thinking about how to categorize people, how to look at people, and think about their rights. I actually find people around the world still today. I find people in this town in Washington, D.C., who actually conceptualize the differences of people as differences between the tribes of Israel and the sons of Noah. So we have, Semitic people and Hamitic people, and those people are cursed, and these people are better, and, based on a kind of genealogical model of people. So we're not talking, in some way, not quite the Purusha model in India of people coming from different parts of the body, but, the good brothers and the bad brothers and all of that. And then you end up explaining equality, gender equality in terms of Adam and Eve. You end up explaining the differences between various peoples in terms of they are the sons of Hagar, we are the sons of Sarah. That's why we live this way, and that's why they are abandoned. The Romans, of course, developed a great deal of civil law with rights and responsibilities based on their own notion of civilization. But again, very strong differentiation, as we know, between citizen and slave, between between the civilized people and the barbarians, with different rights and responsibilities. Ibn Khaldun, great Arab sociologist, writer of Muqaddimah, also followed, came out of Muslim thinking about notions of groups in Islam, and in terms of Quranic teachings and Hadith and so on. Certainly the notion of Muslim versus non-Muslim as one, but then all sorts of interstitial categories of human beings. So Muslims have a category of Ahlul Kitab, the people of the book. Well, the people of the book are Christians and Jews. Then there are people that are not of the book. So they're outside of that. Muslim differentiation on the basis of age, as in youth. Do young people get the same rights and responsibilities under Muslim law, under Sharia, that adults get? No. Why don't kids get treated that way? Because they don't have enough akal, they don't have enough reasonability. So you have to wait till they have enough reason to get this. So reason is a legitimate basis of discrimination. As a parent, I kind of agree with that. What do we do about women in Islam? Well, in their standard argument that I've read and heard is very often that women are then thought to be deficient in akal, deficient in reason, because of their nature and their nature as women, and therefore their reason is somewhat imperfect, and so you need two women to do the legal role that one man would perform. So you need one man as a witness of a crime, but you need two women. A brother gets a full share of a parent's property, a sister a half share. Okay? So a notion of a person as a half person. Remember the U.S. Constitution. Slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person. One sees in other societies what we would call different notions of persons based on age and gender. One of the first societies that I looked at was a student in anthropology with the New Air that have age grades, and as one goes through societies, one gets older, you get different responsibilities, and aged people have more responsibilities and more rights than younger people. Standard age grade system. You also have male segmentary systems that mean that you have basically different lineages or different clans, usually with male heads. The idea is that the men know better what they're doing. They're in the position of authority. However, when Evans Pritchard and other anthropologists then looked at those genealogies, they found a curious thing, and they found women as the heads of all these, of many of these segmentary lineages that men were thought to be heading. And the idea was that the women were called male bulls. Very powerful women in the society who were occupying, in a kind of legal normative sense, were occupying the position of men. I've seen some of that in my own field work. The term Dada, one shall know it, who shall know it, Dada used for your father's father, but I remember living in one community where after a man would die, the grandfather would die, the Dada would die, there would be a Dadi left. Dadi is the wife of is your grandmother. You're on your paternal side. And in some communities, she ends up being called Dada. That is, she takes that kind of role as a female stand-in for that male role. Of course, we're all familiar with Christendom. Particularly during the Middle Ages. It wasn't Europe, it was Christendom. And rights were defined in terms of your religious identification. During the Inquisition, you defined Christians and heretics. And many of you heretics were Christians. So, your kind of rules and rights of responsibility, depended on your status of belief. European common law and feudalism, differentiation in society between serfs and nobles. I mean, ways of dividing out society and then having different forms and codes for recognition of class differences. As I said, by the 16th century, you had, with the exploration of the Americas, you really had questions coming back to Europe about whether these native people in this new land of America were even human beings or not, and rulings that they were, although lesser human beings. And indeed, one could probably argue that in many cases, history of legal codes has been one of defining lesser human beings throughout history. And the debates over slavery, European slave trade with Africa, were precisely over, are people human beings and fully human beings or not? And what rights then should pertain to those people? I would argue that indeed in the late 1700s, with Locke and others, there was a pretty interesting, unique idea that came about. And it, largely came about because of major changes within European, but largely in English society. And you remember what Locke said? Locke said at that time, which was very funny. He said he talked about when all the world was America. Very interesting notion. So at the same time that Native people in America were being denied their notion of humanity, some of our own codes were based on a notion that indeed was, and we kind of know by the noble savage and so on. The idea that in American Indian society, at least Locke's conception, was that you had individual American Indians in small groups who indeed formed their social bonds as a result of their agreement with their fellow people. And so the government was formed as a result of these individual choices among people who shared something. And in American Indians, generally a place of habitation and so on. And I think that was that turned out to be a very interesting break. Of course, what happened after that was the development of evolutionary notions of history and society, where I think, again, we're all familiar with those things that grow out of the work of the French encyclopedists and people like Morgan in this country, Engels, Marx, Tyler, the whole slew of all these things about how society goes from savagery to barbarism. Usually from savagery you would go to lower barbarism before you'd go to higher barbarism, and then you get to civilization. And in those kind of works, I mean, you had people for the first time getting tremendous amounts of really empirical ethnographic data about different peoples from around the world and trying to shove them into some type of conceptual scheme that made sense. After all, everybody wasn't, somebody from Brussels or somebody from London. And what do we make of these people? And so you had all those schemes, largely European-based. They had to figure out what to do with, China and civilization and India, where you did have civilizations. So you call those despotic civilizations. And you had other places that were obviously just places of savagery and barbarism, and you put everybody in a schema to do that. And the idea was that somehow reason, the application of reason among people over time, would lead to people's cultural evolution and development. So if you had savage people, somehow over time, good ideas would triumph, you know, kind of like the Darwinian struggle, you know, for the survival of the fittest. After a while, you know, people would have good ideas and the society would grow and develop, and you'd end up at some point at civilization. And all sorts of things intruded and got in the way of doing that. And where you didn't have that kind of creativity, then people were stuck in or mired in their own savagery or barbarism and could not reach evolution. The nice thing about the evolutionary scheme, of course, was that it allowed for, and you'd seen it before in systems like Hippocrates and others, and certainly Ibn Khaldun, it allowed for the notion of the mutability of human beings. So people weren't fixed species. So people could develop. People could change. You could have social transformation and cultural transformation. And with that, the taking on of different rights and responsibilities and the accord of a more civilized society. That is, people can deal with each other instead of clobbering people over the head with clubs. They can actually have legal systems to adjudicate their differences. That was, I think, a good thing. The negative thing about it, of course, was that in those evolutionary schemes, it was the people making up the schemes that usually ended up on top of the schemes. So, you know, if you were a Victorian Englishman and you were making up the schemes, you can pretty well bet that you would end up as the pinnacle of human evolution and development, and people that you were fighting with or didn't like would end up closer to the bottom. My favorite on that one was actually Lewis Henry Morgan, who was an upstate New York Republican who actually did wonderful books and published a great book, one of the first books at the Smithsonian, on systems of consanguinity and affinity, looking at the human family and the evolution of kinship terminology and so on. That was published it was one of the first publications in the Smithsonian, like 1848 or something like very early on. But he saw in evolution what he saw in human terms, he saw that in physical terms as well. So he had done his work before working on society. He had looked at beavers in upstate New York and their industry and stuff. And he was looking at beavers as an animal, and this was an animal sure to go places. Because it was applying that form of rationality to human beings, to its issues of survival. We all know in the early 20th century that with eugenics, there was a problem of the misuse of evolutionary ideas and theories, so that if indeed people could culturally evolve and develop to higher forms of civilization, then maybe we should breed them that way in the same way that we breed horses and dogs and crops and other things. And that, of course, then starts getting into ideas of who are those groups that you want to encourage to breed and who are those groups that you don't. Who are those groups that you want to take their place in the constellation of humanity? Who are the people that you want to get rid of? We know that anthropologically, and there were anthropologists working in for the Nazis and under Hitler, who actually used, this kind of schema, racial stereotyping and formation to identify people, to figure out what brands of human beings should be destroyed and which ones should be kept. And if you want a case of allocating rights, human rights to people on the basis of their categorization of human beings, that was a pretty stark way to do it. The Soviets did that as well, in some cases on the basis of ethnicity, but more on the basis of class and class categories. So you were lesser if you were high peasantry, or you were merchant class, or you were the a political class that the leadership didn't want to see around. You were put in that category and then sent off, lost your land and sometimes your life. But if I turn back to Locke and the English empiricists for a moment, and the French, our friends, I think, you know, that this comes at a particular time where the notion of individual rights is being stressed as an oppositional movement to monarchs and a privileged class. That is, it doesn't, the movement by which we get to the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and now our contemporary human rights accords don't come, you know, full-blown, but they come at a certain moment of history where they're responding to another issue. And so the issue that they're responding to is monarchical and class privilege and a seeking of opportunity at a time when economic, the economic situation has changed. And indeed, that's why I think you get the kind of contradictions that you do. So, you know, people, Locke and others, are fighting that battle. They're not fighting the battle kind of below them in terms, you know, they're still using slaves. They're still defining people on the basis of gender as not full-fledged, righteous human beings. They're still defining others, but that's not the battle they're fighting. And actually this year we're working on, for the Folklife Festival on the Mall, we've been working with Haiti. And Haiti is going to be the featured country at the Folklife Festival this summer. And the Haitians, of course, used in the late 19th century, used the ideas of the French. They were stimulated by the French Revolution. They were stimulated by the American Revolution. Haitians fought with Americans. So they were stimulated by these ideas of having rights, of not having slavery. They were stimulated by ideas of equality and so on, and they ended up, with the help of yellow fever and other things, defeating Napoleon's troops and achieving independence in Haiti. That was pretty well, but remember, the French, who believed in some of those ideas, fought the Haitians about it. You know, that is, yes, we believe in these rights, but not for us, not for you to have them. And the same thing with the Americans. So you had, basically in the South, a slave-owning society that was not so anxious to see slaves rebelling and claiming their freedom and their very rights. And so, you know, the deal that came about with the United States at that time was basically that, okay, we won't go in and invade Haiti or anything, but we don't want the Haitian Revolution to spread to other countries in the Caribbean and South America. So it kept it inward, and it actually turned the society away from its own coasts and ports and away from the Caribbean and into the hills. And that's why you have the Citadel, for example, as a fort to defend back against the French, because they took to the hills as a way of saying that is the refuge of our movement. As I say, I think the key documents in the development of human rights have been Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and the French Rights of Man and the Citizen in 1789, which I think was the key term in terms of the definition of human rights, because it was the rights of man and the citizen. These, I think, represent these represent great achievements, but also, I think, in the history, particularly of the United States, the issue of making whole the promise and the aspirations of those documents and taking them fully and seriously. And you could, kind of as a key to social history in our country at least, I think you can look at it as a key of economic history, political history, and social history, the battles in the United States, particularly after the Civil War, to achieve what those documents actually promise to the people that they didn't initially refer to. And so certainly the 13th Amendment with the elimination of slavery, the 14th with the Equal Protection Clause, the 15th with voting rights, women's suffrage in the 20th century, and so on. It has been those documents that have inspired others around the world, and I think it was World War II and the dehumanization of various populations that, with the development of the world order, some form of world order through the United Nations, that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights ended up being passed. The U.S. was never so hot on these kind of international accords. Still has a problem with them. Indeed, but it was Eleanor Roosevelt who was tremendously influential and the key person in terms of the development of that declaration in 1948 to get that through. And as you read those Universal Declarations of Human Rights in 1948, I mean, that is passed by the UN. That is all countries of the world signed on to that. Now, everybody didn't belong to the UN at that point, but it's universal. And the other one I gave to you, which was the UNESCO Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity that just got passed in 2001, that will be moving toward a treaty in the next few years. These now represent the, universal now. Universal not in terms of people. The unit here is nations, who belong to UNESCO and the United Nations. But I think you get the gist in the Human Rights Accord that these things are meant to be universal. They're meant to apply to all human beings, not only as citizens of countries, by virtue of their birthright as human beings. This is a pretty far cry from, Hippocrates, totemism, the ancient laws of Manu, and others. And in some ways, they're pretty radical documents. Because, as I think we'll find out in our debates and discussions, they recognize certain things and don't recognize other things. And, for example, when the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights was being debated, it came down to a fundamental issue of recognizing the whole notion of culture and groups. And it's not. The unit is individuals. The unit is persons. And it's people's choice to belong to a culture, but it's not that the culture itself has any standing. And so when you look at these documents, what I'm saying as prelude, and it's enough prelude already, is that look at these as anthropologies in their own right. What do they assume about the nature of human beings, of societies, of the definition of categories of humanness, and the rights accorded to those categories, and what aren't they saying? Because they're almost as revealing in what they don't say as what they do. And again, they're tremendous documents, but they do, and they do stand at the forefront of defining human rights and civil rights around the world today. So what I propose to do for the second part of the session is to look at various vexing issues of human rights and civil rights from different places on the planet today, and discuss those issues in references to those particular documents, rather than to empirical experience, other histories, other books, but just looking at those documents and saying, if these are the charters, if this document represents what human beings have agreed to as the finest aspirations of what people's rights are, then should we do or should we have the rights to do certain things? And that's what we'll look at. So, what I'd like to do before doing that, and maybe having a small break, is to introduce a colleague and friend of mine, James Early. James is the Director of Cultural Heritage Policy at the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. And he's also, if people saw in the Washington Post yesterday, he's the newly named acting director of the Anacostia Museum. James has been very active in the dialogues for civil rights in this country, in the United States, and is one of the leading players right now in the world in the formation of new international treaties and conventions regarding human rights and particularly cultural rights. So let me introduce my colleague, James Early.
Thank you, and good afternoon. The 2004 fellows are taking up a critically important subject that has currency literally all over the world. Almost no week goes by that Richard or Frank Prochan, who is here, or Diana and Jai at the center, or myself, or several other colleagues around Washington receive invitations throughout the U.S. and literally from around the world. This week, I think I'll be speaking to 2 State Department gatherings, Friday and next week another gathering with international scholars on issues of diversity, culture, inclusion, exclusion. The framework that you're going to take up, I think, is most important because you're looking at the politics of civil rights in the arts and the humanities are from those perspectives about inclusion and exclusion. And of course, within the humanities, it is a fair assumption, certainly one to which I support, is that history is the bedrock of the humanities. We must understand things in terms of what has motivated their development, what has been the sociology of that development, what have been the twists and turns and changes, and how do we chronicle that. If you look at this from the point of view of politics, that is the rights and obligations of citizens to mediate their relationship within the public space, then we have but to go back to the founding of this country in the American Constitution to see these issues of inclusion and exclusion. 3/5 of a man, the descendants of enslaved Africans, excluded as a whole human being, but the silent partner that was excluded, the two silent partners really, were black women and white women if you were not a property owner. So already we see embedded in the very constitutional nature of the country, notwithstanding its philosophical virtues, this issue of inclusion, exclusion. If we historicize that, if we take a point of view of watching how it has evolved, then it is not until 1920 that we see that women come into the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, 15th, 19th Amendments really then reflect the dynamism of mediation of these excluded groups, descendants of enslaved Africans, women, white women of whatever class, and I'm being silent for the moment about Native women, mediating their way into the public space, so that I would suggest to you that the qualitative measure for inclusion is the individual as a part of a group coming into the public space, trying to move from the margins to the mainstream. Then we have the debate as to whether you are integrating into what has heretofore been an excluded outlook, or whether you are participating in a very dynamic way to stand on the virtues of what has evolved, but also to look towards the future, angle towards the future, using human creativity to create the notion of democracy as a living proposition, not as a static set of principles to which one meets some timeline or some kind of reading criteria or some kind of other static criterion for citizenship. Now, if the struggle for political civil rights was about entering the public space, we have to also consider it was about entering public documentation, the issue of identity. Who are you, the nation, and who is the excluded? And once the excluded begins to move into the public space, do they assume the posture, the matrix, the template of the citizen that is already there by integrating into it? Martin Luther King, at the end of his life, said, "I fear that we are integrating a burning house." And someone said, well, we must become firemen. We must not run out of the house, but we must close down this fire. And of course, if you close down, then the whole idea is how do you build up? And so is it a question of integrating into a template, or is it a question of integrating for the purpose of also adding an ongoing dynamic that makes democracy a living proposition, again, not a static set of principles? So documentation then goes back to the issue of the bedrock of the humanities, history. How do we tell and retell and tell and retell and tell and retell the story of citizenship in the case of the American Republic, or any republic for that matter? We have a debate today in France as to are these citizens of color and these Eastern Europeans who are not of color, who look just like the old Western Europeans, but whose ways of knowing and doing are quite distinct by way of religion or language or lifestyles, do they represent the static notion that the President of France seems to suggest when he says we want to maintain French tradition? Well, from our vantage point here at the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, tradition really is first and foremost about the creativity of people, about citizens. And if you stop creating, then you're dead. So tradition is not something that's static. It's something that is always evolving, something that we are re-signifying, we're carrying certain things forth, we're leaving certain things behind, we are rearranging the public space, so that the issue of documentation then becomes critical. So that in 1926, Carter G. Woodson, a 20-year-old, when he enters from the coal mines of Kentucky into high school and finishes in 2 years and goes off to Harvard University and receives a PhD, says, "I am not in the history books." And therefore he starts Negro History Week. Well, this becomes a catalyst, it becomes a crucible, a test case of the distinction between the philosophy of American democracy in the public space and the actual practice of that democracy. So now we celebrate African American or Black History Month many, many years later into the 21st century. In the 1960s, with the movement into the public space of the modern civil rights movement, that is premised on the apartheid status legally of descendants of enslaved Africans being excluded, we then see this is a catalyst that opens up the mirror of democracy, and other groups in America look into that mirror and say, you know, I'm not as fully represented as I thought. I could be more represented there. Some groups said, you know, I'm not represented at all. And that became a catalytic factor that opened up the centric studies areas, the arts and the humanities. History and culture, again, becomes very important as the institutional part of entering the public space in the public imagination, so that we have the representation of African Americans, Latino Americans, more exhibitions about women in the public space. With Roots, which is tracing the history of one African American back to Africa, the national television series, which is a part of the public space television, these dissemination mechanisms are public space institutions, and more we are understanding that with cyberspace as we move to more into this global moment, not just the national moment in which we live. Not only citizens of color, if you will, begin to look into that mirror and say, well, how do I more fully represent myself in the history books, in the art exhibitions, and so forth and so on. White Americans begin to ask themselves, is whiteness a culture, or is it simply a physical trait? I'm Irish American, I'm Polish American, I'm Catholic American, I'm Croatian American, Ukrainian American, so forth and so on, which then begins to get back to national and cultural backgrounds and not just to the issue of identification of color as one of the main criterion for entering the public space. All of this then framed in history and artistic representations. And an ongoing mediation. Will it be the biographies of women of whatever the color, or will it be social history? This is another issue of, you know, how do we enter the public space? Who is included? Do we signify, do we symbolize an entire sector through the most elite elements of that sector, or do we also go to something called social history, where grandmothers and aunts and uncles and barbershop owners and taxi cab drivers who perhaps are 5th and 6th grade dropouts who have never entered higher education, they too have history to tell. They too are dynamic parts, or can be more formally dynamic parts of the public space. And so again, we see this mediation going on. Now, I've categorized this to this point by looking at issues of racial contrast and gender contrast. But now let's step inside those two communities and take any community that you would like. If it is a black community, then what about the relationship between black men and white women? And then it will be a class community. It may not be as fully developed as an analog to other class developments, but what about the elite, those with education, businesses, and the like, versus those with little formal education who are working menial jobs, who don't have a lot of time for reflection in exhibition halls or reading history books, who are engaging in the public space by way of the arts and the humanities, basically through radio and television, or some kind of entertainment that is less reflective entertainment than it is enjoyment. So that we have these various dynamics of inclusion and inclusion that we need to look at. And again, if you follow, particularly from the 1960s into the 1970s, when the whole arena of black studies catalyzed, it's been well documented, the whole arena of multicultural development, we discovered that our ways of knowing and doing is not simply one matrix to which we all integrate into, that we come from various backgrounds, historically evolved backgrounds of ways of knowing and doing that are not biological, they're social backgrounds, and we enter the public space building a national identity, struggling to build national unity from these various threads, weaving them into a whole cloth, but always being able to distinguish the individual threads. Now, there is a big debate about that, because we go back to the template. If you look at the most recent book that should have come out on the shelf last week by Samuel P. Huntington, who wrote the very famous essay in the 1890s, The Clash of Civilizations, which was later turned into a book. He now has a new book out of why Mexican Americans are defying our American culture, because they will not integrate into this matrix. They continue to speak Spanish, but of course they speak and read English as well as anybody in the room. And what they're doing is adding another dynamic current, that we are not just monolingual, but we can be bilingual. Indeed, we can be multilingual. So this language issue is also one. And finally, let me sort of conclude to suggest this historical development moving into the physical public space. Remember that the 1870 laws, civil rights laws, trying to make citizens out of African Americans, trying to find the rights for women, including white women, were about entering the public space. 1963, the most sweeping civil rights law that probably has been passed in any nation ever, was a public accommodation, a literally public space. How can you sit on the same bus, go to the same toilet, go into the same restaurant? A public accommodation law. Paralleling to that, again, we see in the imagination, in the history books, we see this layered approach of entering the public space. And in the late 1960s, gay and lesbian people also began to come out of the closet, which suggests that there is a public space, and then somewhere hidden behind is a closet. That too is a distinction. Now we see a full-blown debate, probably the sharpest debate since we have seen the struggle against American apartheid on race, which is fundamentally about the politics of civil rights and culture in the arts and humanities. And you will see this flowering both in the history books, you will see it in exhibitions, you will likely in years to come even see a Folklife Festival here at the Smithsonian Institution that will deal with the folk cultures of gay and lesbian people. So I look forward to seeing how you take these ideas and debate them.
And we're going to do that right now.
Good.
Well, we're back. Welcome back. What we'd like to do now is look at various issues that the group was given slightly ahead of time. And instead of having full-fledged debates, have a discussion. But I would like people to take various positions on this and imagine them to be either proponents or opponents of various positions. These are all very contemporary issues of human and civil rights that are being discussed on the front pages of the newspapers, as James has said, and they're issues both in this country and around the world. The first topic we're going to look at is the problem that gay marriage should be allowed in the United States as a human right. And again, our reference documents are the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity. And again, I'd like people to speak up. If you want to preface your remark by saying, well, if I was a jerk, I would believe in. Or if I was the governor of California, I would believe in. Or if I was some other role, or somebody not as enlightened or not as naive as I, or somebody, if somebody was more thoughtful than I, they would say. So please don't be afraid to do that, because I think this is a real debate. And try to reference the documents if we can. I'd like to do it in some orderly way. So if you just raise your hand and get into it, that's fine. And if somebody has a response to it, just signal to me, and I'll call on you. And Speak up. Yes.
Actually, I'm sorry. If you're drinking out of water bottles, could you actually just fill the cups and not put the water bottles on the table? Because we get that.
Okay. They clunk when you put it down. Okay. So the proposition is gay marriage should be allowed in the United States as a human right, again, based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And again, imagine this as now you're in the United Nations. Okay? You are the delegate from Bratislava or wherever. And for debate in the United Nations, and you're looking at a document that you've all agreed to and saying, this is the basis that we signed on of what we believe. Therefore, I think gay marriage should be allowed as a human right. Or, based on this, there is no way, and this convention is going to have to ratify some new document that enlarges and expands on what we mean by human rights. So, anybody want to take the first step?
Oh, I will.
Okay,
I won't be
please.
shy. There's been so much on this on the news that it's given me a chance to sort of sharpen my own ideas about it. And I'd like to call your attention to Article 16 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights,
Yes.
which says men and women of full age, without any limitation due to race, nationality, or religion, have the right to marry and to found a family. They are entitled to equal rights as to marriage, during marriage, and so it seems to me on the basis of this that you would have no basis for denying people who are old enough from marrying. And I'd also like to look at Article 29 in the same document. And it says, in the exercise of his rights and freedoms, everyone shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law solely for the purpose of securing due recognition and respect for rights and freedoms of others and in meeting the just requirements of morality, public order, and the general welfare. So in other words, not only does marriage seem to be a fundamental human right if you are of age, but there can be no justification for denying the right unless it would harm somebody else.
Response? Usha.
From the JED perspective,
Okay.
using the very same Article 29 and bringing into bearing requirements of morality, if you take the position that this is morally incorrect, it takes away the right that so if this is your right, as long as it is not morally wrong. So standing from the perspective of this is the moral judgment, you don't have the right.
Jean?
Can you give any justification or proof of the notion that gay marriage
interpretations, religious documents, moral documents, that because it is interpretation of, if there is a moral authority that can then say, this is how this is to be interpreted. Moral declaration of it. That's not my argument. But
Dr. Kurin, I'm wondering when you said things that are left out, and I think Usha is bringing up, I mean, I don't know if the word morality is used in here, or religious tradition.
not religious.
morality is used
Issues. In terms, 19 and 29? Or
29.
29.
Okay, now Usha, does that fit into? Okay, can somebody read that who can find that immediately?
Exercise of his rights and freedoms, everyone shall be subject only to limitations as are determined by solely for the purpose of securing due recognition and respect for the rights and freedoms of others and of meeting the just requirements of morality, public order, and the general welfare in a democratic society.
So the argument would be that gay marriage would not meet the criteria of morality.
The just requirements of morality.
And then who defines it? How do you define morality?
And I think that goes
And that's what the
every
argument
talked about is who authors documents and who interprets these documents and who's the authority then to say that this or meets X, Y, and Z requirements. It doesn't go directly only to this particular, so I'm not taking it further.
Well, maybe Jorge has.
I think that we can take this document out of the historical context and try to apply it to this document was written back in 1948. And Article 19, we are making assumptions, okay? Men and women without any limitation due to the right to found a family. Men and women. It didn't say men and men or women and women. Okay, so we kind of stress the truth and cultural assumptions of of our time as interpret, stress the truth, the meaning of this article. Say that also meant gay marriage. So if we are only trying to interpret this article, I get the impression, I assume that they meant marriage between heterosexual people.
So you're assuming men and women of full age without any limitation can marry each other and found a family.
But also in Article 16 it mentions about the family, and that also is not defined.
Correct.
Family. Yeah.
Right, what constitutes a family.
Right.
According to the culture at this time, 1948, a family was such and such.
So you think, so what would be your interpretation then? If you located
In the context of 1948?
Yeah, I mean, this hasn't been amended. I mean, this is the document we're looking at. This is still in play.
I would think that they mean heterosexual family, 2.1 kind of situation, white picket fence.
But I don't think we're bound to interpret it the way it might have been interpreted in 1948, because maybe in part the wording is intended that way so that it can change with time, that interpretation can change. It doesn't say to each other with the man and woman. It talks about man and woman have this right, and it doesn't say who the right is with. So
would you also allow then, the last part of that is the family as the natural fundamental group, and that's what you're raising, would nature then change too since 1948?
But that was a social construction, the 1948 social construction of what was family.
Okay.
Perhaps they didn't.
What did you mean, has nature changed? I didn't quite understand.
I mean, well, taking Henry's point, I mean, he's saying, that if there's an assumption that that it's the notion of family in 1948, that also says that family is the natural unit. So, if they accepted family as the natural unit, what I'm questioning is, has their interpretation changed, which is your argument, or are we arguing that somehow nature has changed?
Or the family has changed.
Well, that would be, yeah. Well,
But that assumes that heterosexuality is nature and natural, and somehow homosexuality is not, that it is unnatural. And and since nature in that sense is only an interpretation or a social construct of what is natural, yes, nature changes if your interpretations change.
And as someone said earlier, how do we define what a family is? That also assumes that a family is something that has been produced biologically as opposed to constructed through adoption or constructed socially.
But if that's true, then wouldn't you grant that even in 1948, people from different societies had different constructions of family?
Sure.
Right?
Absolutely.
Okay, we agree that, right? Everybody has to
and
agree that.
And constructions of normality in terms of
Yes.
sexuality,
Right. Yes.
that has changed,
Right.
whether it was a celebrated status within a society or not.
Okay, but if these, and in 1940, I don't know how many countries were part of the UN General Assembly, maybe it was 60 countries then. If that's the case, and they said that the family is a natural group, and they had something in mind about what that nature of that group is, if they recognized it just as construction rather than as nature, wouldn't they have disagreed about it then?
Absolutely, which may be why the wording is such that, I mean, you're talking about having satisfied conflict. Then the wording allows for that interpretation.
I disagree that they would have necessarily disagreed about this. Documents that you agree to are based on your assumptions. This was based on my assumption that this is a natural thing, involves not only heterosexuality, but also homosexuality, or only perhaps or however that society construed it. As long as you're not saying, as long as I'm allowed to hold my assumption of what these things mean, I don't have to disagree with the document at all. And the fact that this is a document that has been agreed upon by everybody makes no difference whatsoever, as long as the constructs are not what has been agreed upon.
Okay, good. So you're saying that everybody's agreeing to be creatively, suspension of creative ambiguity. Jean, I'm sorry, and then we'll get back to Jorge.
Yeah, I agree with Usha, and the fact it doesn't define what is. So far as we know, all societies have families, but they look very different in different societies. In society, you can say the family is the fundamental unit of society, but you don't have to define what that means.
But while you're there, can you address Jorge's concept, suggestion that indeed this means, it says a man and a woman. I mean,
well, but you could say that. I'm sorry.
You could just as easily argue that the plural here included group marriage, many men and many women, right? It doesn't have to be one and one if we're going to nitpick with the.
Lucy knows, being an anthropologist, used to be called primitive promiscuity. that was a technical term.
Right. Absolutely. It doesn't seem to prohibit group marriage or polygamy. What it does prohibit is marriage of children, and I think that may be the purpose of saying men and women have the right to
Absolutely.
Right.
Well, okay, go ahead. Wait, Jorge wanted to get in, and then Sal.
Yeah, I think that in the very nature of these documents, because they make sweeping generalizations, they try to capture what is general or generic about human nature and human values. These documents leave a great deal of room for uncertainty and for interpretation, and that's something good for everybody. Yes. Okay? The constitutions do that. That's why we have the members of the Supreme Courts across the world. That's why we have the Tribunal of Public Opinion to interpret this, and it's okay. If I were gay, if I were a lesbian, I would rely on Article 19, the definition of love, the definition of marriage. Okay, and that's
16.
important.
16. Yeah, 16.
I'm 16 also.
Sally,
I wanted to address, James, I know you weren't speaking tradition, when you used the word tradition. You were presenting another aspect of it that wasn't what I usually thought of as tradition. I'm wondering, in all the cultures that you've all studied, am I wrong in thinking that for many cultures, a family was male and female and the children that they brought into this world? I mean, can you just wipe away tradition of thousands of years, or am I completely wrong that there was all the group stuff and all this going on that
party time?
Was that predominant? Am I wrong?
Well, we have a few anthropologists around. Here's one.
Well, I think it's thinking about a nuclear family. I mean, that's what the reference is. Don't you think that the assumption is a nuclear family? And clearly worldwide, that's maybe not even a typical form.
I think a fundamental question always is the document an idealized document, and whose ideal is it, and the real lived complexity of human life. So the documentation shows that homosexuality has been around probably from the minute that we became Homo sapien, but it was not a public spaced, sanctioned affair. We have documentation in Africa, for example, of familial relations, not to being family now, of what would be considered lesbian relationships between women, but it was not as common. It was not the common factor. The last factor that I think we have to consider, particularly on this issue, and I would be interested in seeing how you think about it, is that this debate started out about homosexuality. That's really where the morality issue has been. I would venture to say that that has been conceded in the public space. So it's not a question of whether you can be a lesbian and have, or whether you can have children, or whether you can be gay and have a male companion, or whether you can have tax deductions like the rest of us. It is now more at the sort of spiritual level, if you will, of this notion of marriage. And what is the materiality of marriage? Doesn't affect tax laws, because now we have conceded this democratic right in the public space. And so I'd be interested in seeing how you look at this from the vantage point of marriage.
And I think President Bush's attempt to amend the Constitution to define marriage in certain terms speaks precisely to that particular possibility of this, and to take it from, to say you can have civil unions, but you cannot have a marriage. Definitely distinguishes marriage as having somehow a greater, higher level of sanctity to it, moral sanctity to it, which may not be awarded to this, even though public space has now been conceded, and to whatever extent it is conceded, and also that as a civil union this can happen, but not as a marriage.
Let me add another tack to that. Let's say that, you know, it's agreed in this document that the U.S., because of this discussion about, I think, public space and what's happening now, it's largely a U.S. phenomenon. Would then Pakistan say, okay, the U.S. is interpreting this as allowing gay marriage, that's their interpretation of this document, do we want to accept that? That is, that goes to the thing of who makes these, you know, who makes these universal? Does the universal code start becoming less universal because countries say, well, if you're interpreting it that way, we don't subscribe to that document. Now we have our own interpretation, and we can put down a footnote and everything else, but we want to make it very clear. What would you then say if you look at the UNESCO Declaration on Cultural Diversity, Article 1, which basically says, you know, that different cultures have different ways of doing things, and that is a fundamental act of nature, just like biological diversity. And therefore, okay, San Francisco mayor will do gay marriage. Now that couple goes to Islamabad in Pakistan. Does Pakistan have to recognize that marriage? By saying, well, if you want us to recognize that marriage, that's your U.S. imperialistic, your own notion of your immoral, amoral society, and this cultural diversity thing says we don't have to recognize that because you're reporting our culture saying, hey, we can have it how we want. What do we do about that?
You've got to be careful here, because what we're talking about is interesting. Coming accepted in the public space as part of the culture. But this is all being played out in the courts, in legalities. Our laws don't apply in Islamabad. I wish they don't. So they would say, no, take your laws home to your legal entity. But what we're trying to do is discuss cultural awareness across nationwide boundaries, and you can't hang it up on the laws. You've got to talk about the cultural.
Well, it's a good point, and in fact, I mean, for those of you who are not maybe not aware, there's a difference between there's a difference between declarations, which are aspirational documents, do not have the force of law, and international treaties and conventions. And the UNESCO Declaration of Human Rights does not have that status. There are conventions on civil rights, cultural rights, and so on, and economic rights. The U.S. has signed one, not the other. And the cultural diversity argument, which would be an argument that Pakistan would make, this is moving to a legal convention in the next 2 years.
San Francisco marriage is now a legal document.
Yeah.
Right.
Pakistan do.
Well,
I mean, it would have force of law. I mean, then Pakistan legally, formally.
Right.
It's like right now, there are certain ways of doing things here, even if you take culturally, but if it's a legal document, to accept to a legal, may not be culturally, but a legal document would have to be then accepted.
Consider that the of which UNESCO is a part foreshadowed the global moment in which we live. That really becomes the first transnational public space. Now, it does not become a space in which the citizens enter as ordinary citizens. It's the
European Union. This new coming out of Eastern Europe. I think we are on the way to seeing what happens here around gay marriages having positive and controversial implications in other places. And once legal precedent is clear, I would suggest that you're going to see many people sprout up all over the world trying to use that legal precedent emanating from this experience to universalize it to their own experience.
And that can include polygamy, and polyandry, and all sorts of other things. Yes, very much.
Have to be accepted across the world.
Henry.
My ethnicity, and perhaps this that's happening in the United States is at maybe a crucial time, but perhaps it's not quite time for the universal or the global for everyone to accept this, and perhaps it's going to take a little while longer for everyone to catch up. If I go back to Brown versus the Board, before in the United States we said that this is the way things should be done, and it kind of started the ball rolling, so to speak, in other countries. So I'm just thinking that perhaps the time for it to be accepted universally isn't now.
But if I'm gay or lesbian in Malawi, I really don't care about time. I want my freedom now. And so that's a mediating factor as well that I think,
But there's an other side of that, and that is, in your comment, there's an assumption of progress there, and I think Brother James shares that as well. That is, you're assuming that is making progress in terms of a freer, a fairer notion of society. I think other people in that, think of evolutionism. I mean, the evolutionists thought that they were like, hey, this is our way, and, gee, if only those Indians and Africans would just, would get on board and do what we're saying, they would be fine, And so, what do you do when for from another perspective, going back to those age of gold and silver and bronze and iron, or thinking about ancient Indian time in terms of ages of moral degeneration, somebody could look at that and say, my God, this is why Western civilization is going to hell in a handbasket. Because if you think we're going to destroy our society by adopting what you tell us is progressive, we don't want to lose our culture because you're telling us what we're doing. Yes, Jane.
I think at that point you simply stop talking, because we can agree that there are many different opinions about this, but you can't hold all. You have to pick a side.
Well, unless you're right. I'm going to watch what I say. Yes, Ms. Sen.
And as we have discussed, our society evolves over. As society evolves, the definition of different concepts evolves, and I think it's an inevitable process. It does culminate into an inevitable result, just as intercaste marriage was unthinkable in India at one time, just as interracial marriage was unthinkable at one time. So also intersex marriage is unthinkable at this point of time. Same sex.
I'm going to give Jorge and then Henry the last word, and then we're off to the next.
You know, as we discussed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UNESCO the Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity, we find no legal precedent in the United States.
Rose have an interesting point. Okay, you in the late 1950s, and I'm not sure these scientists, Master and Johnson or Kingsley, came out with this magical 10% that out of the at least 10% were gay, right? This magical 10%. So they were statistically, they were a minority, and perhaps they will always be a minority. We don't know. We don't know for sure. So assuming that they were a minority, should we care for them? Should we protect their rights? That's what is at stake. I mean, that's the meaning of a democracy. Because first is them, then the people that are wearing earrings. You know, you don't know how to define their sexual orientation. They were one, they were two, people who dye their hair. Do you like them? Do you dislike them? People who are overweight. I mean, people who wear very colorful clothing. I mean, how do we deal with them? And so even if I don't necessarily empathize with the plight of gays, and I do, because some of you know, I in my family there were at least 2 gays. So I have to empathize with them. I better empathize with their plight. Even if I did not, I mean, it's an issue that has to do with a democracy.
Henry, last word.
Go back to what Shweta mentioned about the inter-class marriage, and then
I guess my is well, as with the U.S. Constitution and other things, that if you to make the case, you would have to amend these documents to make it clearer in terms of body used obvious ways. And you know, the on the other side is if you take Article 2 to everything in this document. But what's not pointed out is, you know, without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political, everything is in there. That is, everything in this document applies to everybody, irrespective of anything, almost except that one provision. And then the question is that one provision different because of the wording of man and woman? And I think we've agreed that it is ambiguous and it could be read either way. So I think we'll leave this one to the General Assembly and UNESCO, and move on to the next issue, which is Muslim women in Saudi Arabia. The proposition is Muslim women in Saudi Arabia should be allowed the same rights as Muslim men. And as I said in the talk, I mean, one finds many things in Saudi and Muslim tradition about various ways in which people are treated equally or equitably, but there are indeed many areas where a woman's share is a half in that sense, in terms of inheritance, and a legal. There's different procedure in terms of divorce. It's not a straightforward equitable relationship. Women cannot drive and meet with unrelated males. So. Proposition. Yes.
I get upset with the whole thing of the United States becoming the bully. And do I have a right to go to Saudi Arabia? Do I have a right to, maybe they explain the Quran in terms of that's the way they understand the law. why does everything have to be Western? I mean, I understand human rights, and I'm for that. I don't. I mean, this is very strict, and those are those rules. There are rules. The Army knows there. You can't take a Bible in. You can't take a cross. That's the rule. So you're in Saudi Arabia. Do you do what Saudi Arabia does, or do you say, don't do that in the West, and we need to rethink all this? I don't know. I have mixed feelings about it.
Don't you want to share your virtues and have everybody in the world
enjoy
the riches?
The Muslim, I do not want to offend their beliefs.
So you're a relative.
I think they're wrong.
So you're a relativist. It's all good.
No, you pushed me into a corner.
Jean?
I think you may be making the assumption that
years ago. Same kind of arguments were used, that they had insufficient, that they were being protected by their husbands or their fathers. And so we've been down this road before. And there were plenty of women who did it, but there are many who didn't.
Going back to what Sally mentioned, that's fine for us, but who are we to impose on another culture? If we go back to what Dr. Kurin mentioned earlier, that there's a notion out there that civilization or societies through time provide a better civilization. The United States is a little bit older than 200 years, whereas the Saudi Arabian is lived much longer, if I could say that. And so
actually Saudi Arabia is a much newer country than the United States.
Yeah, much.
But Islam is a lot older. Islam is a lot older. Yeah.
But that goes to whether this is Islamic law, talking about a political institution that is creating, or are we talking about laws, and what is the relationship, or what needs to be the relationship between those two?
Well, Article 18 of the thing says everybody has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change religion or belief for freedom, alone or in community with others, in public or private, to manifest his religion, teaching, practice, worship, or observance.
So the crux goes to, is this a religious mandate, or is this a political, social mandate? And
two questions share, right? Because where do morals come from? They come from people's religions, right? Values are the more kind of societal. And, when there's this problem where there's a clash or a conflict between the two, that's where you get stuck.
You get politics.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, James.
Consider that our discussion at this point has been sort of about the other national over there. But consider in a global moment that there are probably right now throughout the United States a number of Saudi American citizens, men and women, whose tradition is now a part of the American, and certainly among Muslims more generally beyond Saudis. Consider that there are women citizens in the United States today who say, well, I want to participate in female mutilation. They wouldn't call it that, use that term. Or, I do believe that I should only get half. How do we mediate that when the them are now us citizens? Are we still so generous as to say, let's not take our Western viewpoint over there, when actually our Western viewpoint may no longer be as pure a Western viewpoint as we have been thinking? Let's look around the table of the faiths, the religions, the races, the ethnic groups.
So what will we do then?
go back to
that allowing fundamental rights protected in the constitutions, one of the four freedoms, but at the same time, when these practices harm others, opposed to the general good and to the public order. So that if your religion practices human sacrifice, for example, then that could be, I would certainly say it is opposed to the public order, to the general good.
So if the Saudis claim that a woman shouldn't be allowed to drive, is that harming the public good and the public order?
Yes, because that is restricting the rights of women, and that affects all women.
But what about Article 18, that you have the right, the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, to practice your religion? What if it's your religion to do that?
But again, I go back to what I said before, that you're free to practice your religion so long as you do not influence or detract from the rights and freedoms of another.
But what if it's your personal choice?
If it's your personal choice. Yeah. I don't like to drive on the Beltway. But there's a difference between being a person and being at a mandate from somebody else.
And so if your religion believes that this is God's law, that is, it's not your, it's not, I mean, if your religion is that it's God's law to do this, it's not my job to kind of adjudicate God's law, then what do? If that is indeed part of your religion.
In this scenario, who am I? Am I the Lord?
You're you. You're not driving on the Beltway. I got a ticket on the Beltway this morning.
That was really good.
But there's also in the selection about cultural diversity, the document about cultural diversity, it says cultural pluralism gives policy expression to the reality of cultural diversity. Article 2, under the section Identity, Diversity, and Pluralism. So in other words, you can't mandate a whole society from one religion, say. You can only have a truly free society and one that is pluralistic.
So you would disagree with Mr. Chirac, who the same Muslim women who were not allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia but want to wear the hijab in Paris to go to school, you would be against him. You would be against the restriction of the hijab because people want to practice their religion.
Yeah, that's an argument basically about clothes, and I think it's interesting. Paris, but it's about headscarves and cross and jewelry. If you wear a headscarf to keep the rain off, is that okay? It's one that does no harm to wear a headscarf.
Well, does it? I mean, that's the thing. Is it have to promulgate one particular culture over another?
Sure, but you got to have assumptions.
I would like to make two comments. When you talk about the fear that, especially Americans, I think, liberal Americans have of intruding into somebody else's business. I mean, our business is being human. Okay, it's about humanity. Okay, and you have the right to express your own opinions about how the people live. They might not want to listen to what you have to say. Okay, when you talk about culture, we're also making the assumption that each and every person that lives, for instance, we're talking about Saudi Arabia, that each and every person that lives under the roof of Saudi Arabia is perfectly happy with these laws. They might not, especially women, right? They might not, okay? And the problem when it becomes the state that institutionally support these measures. I mean, we by custom can be very, very conservative, and that can be my option. But the state shouldn't be intruding basically into my private affairs and basically supporting one in one way or the other, one point of view, one religion. So again, we are going back to this issue of freedom of choice, okay? And as far as Jean's comment about this scarf, that's more than that. I mean, just by reading, some statistics about France, it has over 5 million people of Middle Eastern ancestry. So for them, it's like a hot potato. It's a very sensitive cultural and political issue. And now after September 11, it's a main issue. Chirac was at the forefront, opposing the intervention in Iraq, unilateral intervention in Iraq, and now you could question his views about the support that he really have for people that come from the Middle East. Okay, it's okay for him to be liberal in international affairs and be socially and culturally conservative inside France.
James?
I think one of the other considerations here is that as we have evolved through history to this present moment, we have moved more and more from the private as a group to the individual to the multi-sectoral cultural nature within a given juridical boundary called a nation. And then we have something called crimes against humanity. So that all of these documents are always seeking for some kind of complementarity. One document in and of itself, even the Bible, even the Quran, the various modes of interpretation, the various groups that evolve and organize a sociology based on the same text, but they're different groups. Look at what's happening in Iraq today. Muslims, but using the same Quran, but with different interpretations. So that perhaps we are at a moment now where we should be concerned about what we think is virtuous, sharing that with the rest of the world, but also being more open to what they may think is virtuous, that we might also particularize to our own national experience. It still does not relieve us of the responsibility of discrimination and setting laws. For example, polygamy and marrying young girls, 14, 13. Are we going to be so generous in our context? This begins to be a universal phenomenon, and it's a universal phenomenon not because it descended from on high, because we have brought these views into now the global public space, and we're mediating them, and we're searching for new codes, new tradition, more formality. And I'd like to hear your thoughts again. Does that bring you closer to?
Yeah. One thing, and I don't know if this is completely off the wall, but the fact that some of these countries, Iraq is going to be an Islamic state, we understand separation of church and state, and it seems to work. It just works. They do not believe that that is true, and they don't believe that way. So can I infringe on them that this is the way? You have got to have church, you have to have separation. And Saudi Arabia and the new Iraq is going to say, no, we're going to have an Islamic state, and that's part of our bylaws.
And Dean will disagree with them.
Well, if you believe in the free exercise of religion, then you can't have a theocracy, because that denies to minority religions the right to practice their religion. And the 4 under the section of cultural diversity and human rights says it implies a commitment to human rights and fundamental freedoms, in particular the rights of persons belonging to minorities. So that if you can find a nation that has no minorities, let me know. But so far as I know, all nations, there is no nation that is completely homogeneous, no matter how much their rhetoric may like to claim that. So if you have a country that has a religion, you say this is the religion you must practice and no others are allowed, and you can't even be allowed to show the symbols of your religion, then you can't have freedom of religion.
So in the guise of not recognizing the cultural values of the majority, because it's about offending the values of a minority, you won't have them about a majority either. There'll be U.S. provisions. Okay, that is, if you look at the Article 4, basically, I mean, what I think it does, it basically says that yes, cultural diversity is good. We like cultural diversity. We want it to pay attention to rights of minorities, but where there's a conflict, the rights of the individual, that is human rights, trump all. That's basically what I say. So then where you get stuck then is, how do you recognize cultural diversity? Because cultural diversity, you're recognizing non-individual rights, you're recognizing the rights of a cultural community.
But Saudi Arabia doesn't want cultural diversity.
No, the cultural diversity is not within Saudi Arabia, it's Saudi Arabia versus the United States. I mean, Jacques Chirac is arguing under the basis of this kind of thing that this should protect French cultural diversity vis-a-vis American globalism. That's what his fight is.
Right.
This isn't, he's not looking at it internally to say, how do I protect Jews and Sikhs and Muslims in Paris schools? He's looking at this as, how do I protect French wine, French films, and French other things in light of American stuff?
Exactly.
Yes, wait, Jorge. And
Yeah, something I would like to comment. It's about the Declaration of, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Most rulers, most statements in the last 50 years have paid lip service to the content of this document. Okay, it's politically expedient to court the Western world and the so-called Western democracies. But back at home, you can tell that over the last 50 years, very few people are familiar with the content of the Declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You know. You can basically conduct surveys all over the place, or perhaps there's only a tiny minority of the people who are familiar with this. So is my content part of this chapter? Yes, it is. So how come they are not enforcing these provisions? They are quite revolutionary, as you mentioned at the beginning. They are great principles. Are they enforceable? Who would be in charge of enforcing them? The United Nations is a supranational institution. They have been involved all over the place over the last 50 years. How come they have been unable, basically, to coerce, if they could, some government respecting the human rights, the civil rights of their own populations, because there is no political will?
I guess the question goes back, though, can you have, if you did follow the Declaration of Human Rights, can you have cultural diversity throughout the world? That is, does the Declaration presume certain ideas about individuals, about the nature of the person, the nature of consciousness, the nature of society, such that you would end up with, essentially, a U.S. viewpoint of the world?
Western, at least.
Yes. Yeah.
Well,
Yes.
in terms of diversity and how much we're going to accommodate, and do we really have separation of church and state in this country at this moment in time, despite what our documents say?
And God we trust.
Right.
On our dollar bill.
We're doing away with all that.
Yeah. Henry?
I was just going to say that the idea of cult, at least from what I understand, the idea of separation of church is to protect the church and not necessarily the state. And so, undertone.
Well, I think it's the reverse. I mean, the state, that the diviner from whoever is on high and beyond to we the common citizen, and that the opening up of civil society or the public space was actually a way of getting the religious people out of being the giant landowners, the degree makers, the lifestyle setters, and giving us an opportunity to be diverse and bring forth private perspectives and the like.
But and that's why I think we too, our country and our historical experience is subject to our own, to our history. What do we do later this year when the Iraqi people vote for a constitution and vote in it Sharia law as a fundamental part of that constitution? They said, we've done this by your rules. We've done this democratically. Okay, we've done it democratically. What then do we say? Do we say, well, no, we don't, that's not a true function of democracy, because if you did it democratically, you would come up with the same formulae, the same perspectives, the same laws as we have? Or do we say, Mazel tov.
Are women voting? And if you say
Yes.
if you
In fact, they have affirmative action. They're going to be at 25%
of the seats.
at least 25%.
More than.
we've got
And if we think of all those patriarchal societies are so patriarchal, like India that's had a woman prime minister, like Pakistan that's had a woman prime minister, like Sri Lanka that's had a woman prime minister, Bangladesh that's had a woman prime minister, like Israel that's had a prime minister. Yes?
The color of democracy cannot be USA all over the world. If we are talking about this whole system, there was a talk by a woman from Afghanistan just a couple of days ago, and they're going through the thing. They're putting so many seats aside for women, but there's 90% illiteracy amongst women in that country. Now, so what are the men going to do? They're going to choose, they're going to be women puppets. So it's tokenism all over again. And it's very, very hard to impose these kind of cookie cutters to different cultures, different systems of government. And when we talk about France or we talk about here, it's a power struggle first. It's my values, it's our imposed. And that's where accommodation comes in. You know, what am I going to accommodate to, how far, etc. So it's firstly power.
Anything else, Lisa?
Would you say then that these aren't universal human rights, that these are only Western human rights?
They are relative and interpreted, within.
This has been a large debate in a lot of the international rounds over the last few years, where a lot of countries have argued that yes, these things were accepted at a certain point in a certain political power relationship after World War II. A lot of countries who were part of this Universal Declaration of Human Rights did not exist as sovereign countries at that time, and that many people have pointed out various biases with those.
I mean, the U.S. left
basic assumptions.
The U.S. left UNESCO over the struggle of the new information society, the call for a new organization of media and what are the images and the storylines and the dissemination. I think I'd ask you to consider, is it an expectation of text, philosophy, and law that drives human change, or is human change actually the movement of people that drives the change in documents? And our focus has been really the expectation of philosophy and text, and human movement might be really where we may want to give not exclusive attention to, but looking more at a developmental linkage between actually people saying, Martin Luther King said, an unjust law is no law at all, so that I am going to defy your law, and then I expect that you will put me in jail. I will demand that you put me in jail. And through that process of movement, I will break down not only the written law, but the whole code of behavior, and you will then move along with me. And so as we think about that in this global moment, we see global civil society organizing now, not at the same level or scale or resources as transnational corporations are as politicians, but you've got the World Social Forum, A New World is Possible. You've got people meeting on 50 different perspectives on water somewhere in the world right now from all around the world, and on HIV/AIDS and nuclear issues and affordable housing. You got Jimmy Carter, and it's not just him, he begins to be symbol, but you've got the incarnation of him in different cultural modes saying, yes, let's build houses. So I'd ask you to think more about human movement define decree and code to really expand decree and code.
And I think that's the kind of back and forth over intergovernmental groups and at the official level. I mean, these are UN, UNESCO, these are organizations of nations, states parties to them. So they're collections of governments, and there is a kind of tendency to think that by sitting around in that room and writing, putting ink on paper, that represents a kind of certain reality. And I think, as Jorge has said, many people have used these documents in a, just for window dressing in many cases. And there's also an implicit kind of idea sometimes about how culture happens, that sometimes I think it's very Disney-esque. We're a small world after all. You got your culture, you got your culture. We're all living happily. And as I remind some of my UNESCO colleagues sometimes, because there's various programs to recognize the cultural achievements of each other, that and they say this should be done in accord with human rights and out of mutual respect for societies. And I like to remind my colleagues that I'm not trying to be a pain in the ass or anything, but many of epics are about how my people destroyed your people. Exactly. So let's celebrate the epics, but it is about how my king wiped out your king. Okay. Now that we've solved the issues of gay marriage and Muslim women, if we can move on to Tibetans and Chinese. And the situation, I think, as most people know, just snapshot here, is basically that the Chinese went into Tibet, and they basically said they did it for Tibetans' good, to advance their society, because the priesthood was exploiting the Tibetan people. This was a backward society, and the Chinese government was going in to bring the benefits of modernization and rationalization and so on to the Tibetan people. Dalai Lama went to India, still at Dharamsala. And when he's not punching me in the stomach, is still providing a symbol of, Tibetan aspirations for at least some degree of control over their own future. So, what do we do? Do the Tibetans, according to our Universal Declaration of Human Rights, have a right to their Tibet?
Article
Yes.
15.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Article 15, everyone has the right to a nationality.
Okay.
No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality nor denied the right to change his nationality.
So you think...
I think they were deprived of
Okay.
their nationality.
Anybody have a counter-argument? Anybody from the Chinese Ministry of Yes?
We tend to be extremely liberals, okay? So, has the right to self, okay? Ethnic minorities have the right to succeed, or, ethnic minorities have the right to succeed. Quebecois have the right to become...
Where is this now?
I'm not sure how the right... but what I'm saying is part of the common, I would say, of the common discourse. I'm not necessarily making reference to these documents.
Yes.
When it comes to other more sensitive issues like religion, we are very adamant to basically to become interventionists. We have a chart of the United Nations, and based on that chart, we make the assumption like that is the nations across the world back in 1948 make certain decisions, okay? Came up with some general principles, okay? Idealistic principles. But when it comes to, I don't want to take you back to Saudi Arabia, but I would say, following the same logic of argument, I think that China has the right, basically, to territorial integrity. That means, because you talk about self-determination, how about self-determination for Afro-Americans? That became an issue back in the 1920s. Before, basically, prior to these great black migrations from the South, members of the Communist Party in the United States were talking about the possibility of creating a distinctive Afro-American nation in the South. How about self-determination for Native Americans, for people of Mexican ancestry, especially in those places where they are physically concentrated in the Southwest, and for Puerto Ricans and Dominicans in New York.
And don't forget that town or village in Vermont that wants to go to New Hampshire.
And Staten Island wants to secede.
Which it should. Oh, sorry, people out there from Staten. No, seriously. A very strongly worded assertion from Jorge. Do we agree with this?
And by Article 21, where people shall be the basis of the authority of government, if the people do not have the will to be party to that government, or belong to that government have a right, according to this article, to secede.
Do they have a right to secede?
Richard?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No.
Well, and then, I mean, this logic of self-determination would bring back to a major theme of this seminar, then why do we have integrated schools? When the schools in the South in the mid-century, or the last century, had no desire for integrated schools.
So the Tibetan people should separate so they can have their own place.
I'm saying that at times in history, larger people have imposed certain structures on a region because they, in the argument of these are greater human rights.
So the Tibetans should stay part of China so that they can achieve justice in China.
So that there can be greater justice according to the Chinese. Not my necessary argument.
No.
I'm not sure which side you're on.
Well, it's a tough one. I mean, I think the example you gave was more clear cut. You know, than
I'm just questioning the idea that self-determination is all. What I'm doing is I'm questioning the idea that self-determination is always good.
Yeah. What if the bad guys want to self-determine? I mean, look at Yugoslavia and look at Bosnia and Herzegovina. But then we keep countries together against the will of their citizens?
Oh, but you can't. Not according to Article 21.
Well, 21 doesn't say you dissolve the country.
Oh, but it says people can only be governed in the ways that they approve of being governed. So the authority of government has to be approved by the people of that government. So if they don't, right to having their own government, which is part of self-determination.
Well, that's the next step. It's not quite. I mean, you're coming at as an implication of that, because it doesn't say then you can go out and form your own government. It just says that would be a deficiency then that would have to be restored in a way.
Well, it implies it in the preamble. It says where it is essential if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression. So it does say that this is the last resort.
And if you don't have that, then you may go to that last resort.
Yeah, I should say, just for clarification, because it can be confusing. When the provision on nationality, everybody has the right to nationality, Article 15, and no one shall arbitrarily be deprived of nationality. Nationality is not the same thing as having your own state.
No.
So you can have a nationality within a state. Soviet Union was a good example of that. The Chinese would actually claim that the Tibetans do have nationality. And they still do. They're a national minority. In fact, the Chinese would claim that very fervently. They would also, I think, claim that the Tibetan people would Chinese, that are part of China, and accept that form of government, although the issue of a plebiscite or something like that is another matter. Yeah, Gene, I'm sorry.
I think this is part of a larger philosophical question. I mean, do Tibetans have the right of self-determination? They certainly do, right? And here you have an intersection of ethnicity, religion, and the legacy of the Cold War.
Patronized by companies like Walmart, should do. Larger issues. It's not only self-determination for ethnically, distinctive, groups, but also like general human rights.
Yes.
This is just a question. How far or what? First, the question of self-determination is, I think, determined to a large extent by considering whether a country was taken over due to imperialistic policy. I think that's one of the questions that we have to consider when we determine whether
Yes.
Well, and we have a legacy of countries that were put together as a result of that, right, that now find themselves somehow a nation. So the other side of Jorge, you can look at it from the Tibetan point of view in terms of self-determination, but then you can also look at it from the larger national point of view, which I think is what you're saying, okay, if this is part of my, the integrity of this country to some degree, for better or worse, whether it was the empiricism of Genghis Khan or whether it was the imperial aspirations of the Chinese communists, either way, this has a recognized territorial integrity. The question is, what is then incumbent upon those Chinese citizens? That is, Tibetan aspirations are not aspirations at play here. That is part of a Chinese larger nation. What do you do about Iraq these days? Clearly a country that was put together in a colonial situation.
Or the Kurds.
Well, and that's why. I mean, the Kurds have that issue, and I think that's exactly what's being played out. You can ask the Tibetans, do the Kurds have that? And your question kind of begs that. Yes?
This seems a question that I feel really incapable of deciding this without knowing a lot more about the Tibetan and Chinese history. There are a great many countries that came into being through horrific means, including our own. And there have been cases when countries have disappeared and then been reformed. So that it seems that this question is a more particularist one than that. Is it so much a question of human rights or of a particular nation building?
Well, remember, go back to the Declaration of Independence, remember, so people have these inalienable rights as people, as individuals, not as cultural groups, not as religions, not as anything. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their power from their just powers from the and that is some form of consensual ability to be governed. So the question, if you take that question from that perspective, that's almost it ahistoricizes it. There's real. What could possibly be the historical things if you're endowed by your creator, if you are a human being and you have the right to form my own government, then what kind of history can stand behind that? However, on the other side of that, can we afford, take New York City? I mean, it's Staten Island today, people in Queens tomorrow. You got Brooklyn. Does Bensonhurst declare itself a separate nation in the midst of wonderful Brooklyn? I mean, kind of where does that end?
Which you might want to. Doesn't that also, if you assume that that governments derive their power from the just consent of the governed, doesn't that also assume that the government exists to protect the rights of the people? So if it doesn't, does that still apply?
Well, that was actually in the Declaration of Independence, if you remember. It doesn't begin with that. That's the second thing. It's when in the course of human events or something like that. That is, the idea is that compact has been broken.
Right.
And because it's broken, now we want to fix it.
Which could be the Tibetan argument.
Yeah, that could be the Tibetan. That could be certainly the Kurdish argument. I mean, these things start coming into play when people actually do go to things like the World Court or world bodies and argue on the basis of some form of legitimacy. That, according to your human rights declarations, we should have it this way. And then people kind of start invoking it. Okay, any last words on the Tibetans? Okay, final word, final thoughts here, as we've now solved the problems of the world. I think we've got a lot of work to do. Anybody?
I guess you
Great point.
Yeah.
Great point.
But I think that, is one of the things. I think a lot of the, again, a lot of the assumptions we have about the human rights movement in terms of, kind of legal structure at the international level really does come out of the American Revolution, and then various derivative things that come out of that. And as I was talking about, before, like with, Haiti, and people taking things as an example and then moving it and trying to apply to their own circumstances. And yet, in those documents are a lot of
when we come to frameworks, they really, pretty restrictive cultural systems. Now that's good, because, in one way, because it said, hey, we're going to go ahead and do it and define it this way. We've got a country to run, and this makes sense, and we're going to pick one. I can't sit here being an anthropology culturally relativistic without a constitution. How do you write a constitution? How do you make charter documents? So you can't quite do that. On the other hand, the choices you make and the things you pick also then, kind of channel the scope of what you do. And I think when you're doing something within a particular historical, cultural framework, the language and the assumptions you make at least may resonate. And then the issues become, hey, they're not broad enough. This is men. You're excluding women. You're counting some people as 3/5. You're making a distinction between free and unfree. I mean, these have contradictions within that cultural system in that historical moment. When you start expanding around the world, your assumptions start multiplying exponentially. Right. In terms of your ideas about the person, about social units, about ideas of justice, about ideas of rights, and so on, and they create much larger conundrums.
Especially with the language. I mean, we're all speaking English, so we think when somebody says accommodations, we all clue in on that. But I cannot imagine. I don't know what we decided, but we had fun.
So in the internet, which in some ways may hasten ways that inability to understand. I mean, those misinterpretations without the face-to-face.
It masks them in many ways.
Exactly.
It really does. It really
Or consider that English really is the lingua franca of global governance. Last week, I spent a week in Albania and in Kosovo. I must have given 7 speeches in like 2 days in Albania, and I spoke in English to all audiences except one, and one audience in which I translated was being used, the majority, like 90% of the people there, spoke English. But consider that 100% of those people were Muslim. So while they were speaking English, they were not thinking in the content of the words necessarily. It's not that we were missing one another.
Right.
And that is that people take English and turn it to their own cultural evolution. I'm trying to follow a case in the UK now, in London, of an Indian family who came, and the father started making samosas, a little shop. Now it's a $70-some-odd million a year business. And the mother, I wish I had the article with me, the mother, at one point, the father said, there's a legal issue coming up. I want you adult daughters to give your shares of the business to your mother so that we can handle this legal issue. Now, this is a family operation. They are now adults. But the mother now will not give them back. And she says, in Hindi tradition, she is somehow the embodiment of the riches of the family, and that these kids have gone Western on her, and they got it all wrong. But she is a citizen of the UK, so now we have the intersection of 2 heretofore national public spaces actually evolving something new. So it would be very interesting to see how this law boils out. Will they give any weight to tradition? Or will they simply westernize the whole deal? The last one I wanted to make is to be somewhat redundant, that when you go through these texts,
and you look at the corpus of documents and like, they are more often than not literary and philosophical interpretations, and there are multiple cottage industries. In fact, one might even argue intellectual corporations around the world who do nothing but study documents and write documents. But the real question is, are we following the actual developments in real life? And I think particularly with students. And at the university, once we see students see the law that says do not traverse across the grass, and then, 5 years later, you get this nicely beaten path. What does the school do? It goes and lays a sidewalk right down there, because real life has altered whatever compelling logic that we originally had for that. It's not that the sign was unimportant, but it really is how people determine they're going to use their creativity to continue expanding lived categories and to force those lived categories to be reflected in more symbolic, literary, religious codes, comportment, so forth and so on.
I think I have to leave. Yes, I have to leave the last words to you, because I think we have to sign off now. So, Angela?
Yes.
That's
Right.
what I teach my
Right.
students.
Right.
You can't make
Dr. Richard Kurin, James Early, for giving us such an informative, stimulating afternoon. You only scratched the surface.
Well, but I scratched. There was a lot of scratching going on. We had a lot of
Thank you.
participation. Thank you.